All right, welcome back to the Agile Accountant and our third session with Catrin Evans, talking about Excel and modeling and Agile. And our question for this session, Catrin, is, does every accountant need to be a modeler?
For me, no, but I think every accountant needs to have reasonable Excel skills
Hmm.
and understand what formulas are available, because it makes life a lot easier and a lot quicker if you have that toolkit to be able to use Excel to help you every day. It doesn't mean you need to be building big complex models, but being able to do your data analysis. We mentioned in the previous session there are about 30 formulas that I have
Hmm.
that can be
Hmm.
applied. And for me, it's about being able to upskill accountants so that they're not fighting every day to do some of the things that might seem quite simple, but without the knowledge of Excel means they're finding it very hard. So for me, it's about accountants being given appropriate training in Excel, because everybody assumes as an accountant that you can use Excel.
Yeah,
But it's not part of your exams. It's not
true.
provided as formal training as part
Yeah.
of your qualification. So how do people know what their Excel skill level is? I've had people say, "Oh, I thought I had quite good skills," but actually they can use a VLOOKUP and a sum and maybe a pivot table, but because they don't know what else it can do, they've been struggling and spending days. And I've worked in places where you go in and people are saying, "Oh, it takes me 3 days to do this at month end." And I sit down with them and say, "Well, if we
Have you thought
use
about
this
this?
formula,
Hmm.
it takes half a
Oh,
day
yeah.
off the process." So for me, this comes back to what's the difference between a spreadsheet and a modeler. All accountants need good spreadsheet skills. They don't all need to be modelers.
And what sort of skills then, spreadsheet skills, Excel skills, should we be looking at if we want to improve our analyst abilities, but maybe, look towards becoming a modeler in the future? What area? Because we don't need to know all the formulae that are in Excel. That would be
No.
impossible. So, where do we focus our attention in developing Excel skills?
So for me, it's about thinking, what are the day-to-day processes that as an accountant we're trying to do?
Hmm.
And saying, right, is there a formula that allows me to pick up any invoice that's got the prefix of, I don't know, the subsidiary, which might be CRA. I'm just
Yeah.
picking those letters off the top of my head. But if everything is CRA with a different number, that's where we mentioned left and right in the previous
Yeah.
section.
Hmm.
If we
Hmm.
say equals left
Yeah.
3, we
Hmm.
can then do a sum if on all invoices that have got CRA as the left 3 letters. That's a
Hmm.
lot easier than you trying to go through and do some kind of wizardry
Yeah.
that you don't know how to do it.
Yeah. Yeah.
So they can be quite simple things, but it's just, if you don't know, you don't know what you don't know. So to know that there is a formula equals left, that's very powerful. So for me, it is just trying to find some way of knowing. It's perhaps saying, what are the things I'm trying to do, and then saying, let me go and play around in Excel, or find,
Yeah.
often I'd say better find somebody who's got more Excel skills than
True.
you
Yeah.
have, and just ask the question, can you think of a way I can do this more easily? Which for me is being agile and working as teams and communicating. And then it's about having that analytical mindset that says, what is it we're trying to do? What does this information tell me? Every accountant is knee deep in data most days of the week. Some of it needs to be turned into a model, but actually, if we want to really understand the business, I've always, there's a good saying, which is, rubbish in, rubbish out as far as models are
Yeah.
concerned. You can have the best model going, but if that data going in isn't correct or nobody understands it, you're not going to get a good output. So for me, an accountant should have a degree of data analysis ability. I'm not saying they need to be data analysts, but again, it's not just about understanding FRSs and
Yes. Yes. I agree.
the accounting regulations. It's how do you get that information out and make sure it's giving you what you need.
So, is there any sort of sources that you would suggest people look into? Any books? I know there's good YouTube Excel trainers that I certainly watch from time to time to learn new formula and learn new tricks.
That's an interesting one. There are plenty of people out there who provide Excel training.
Hmm.
There's not one I would specifically recommend because
Okay.
I haven't used them, but I
Hmm.
think the key thing for me would be about saying, what is it you want from the
Hmm.
training? Are you trying to become a modeler? If so, there are boutique modeling firms out there offering modeling training. But I remember when I was in the Big Four, we often used to provide modeling training courses for some of the banks and things like that. And they'd give us a list of, we want to be able to do this debt calculation and that complex calculation. And you'd get the people in the room and you'd end up teaching them some of the basic Excel formula because they didn't have the toolkit to be able to do the calculations they needed. So you ended up not
Yeah.
teaching them what they'd asked for, but you actually gave them the starting point. So for me, it's about looking at are you wanting training as a modeler? Are you wanting Excel training for accountants? So
Hmm.
are you
Hmm.
being taught by somebody who is an accountant? And I think the key for me is, great, you could go on an Excel training course and say, I just want to learn the formulae. But the niche for me would be saying, find somebody who can tell you how to apply those formulae,
Yeah.
where in your day-to-day job
Yeah.
they might come in
Exactly.
useful.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. Okay. Let's move on to a kind of related point, which is something that you said earlier. The numbers look great, but what do
mm,
they mean? How do we develop our what do they mean skills?
yeah. And I think that's where we all bring out our inner 3-year-old and constantly ask why um, or what. And I think for me, it don't take things at face value. If a calculation comes out and you think that doesn't look quite right, go and have a look at it. And also develop the ability to say, how do you quickly sense check outputs?
Mhm.
And this was something when I managed a team of bid analysts for many years. And the more senior in the team, we would review the models and they'd often come to us and go, how did you find that mistake? And I'd say to them, well, I did a quick calculation. I know on average, and rates have changed since then, but on average, I'd expect an overall NI rate of 8%.
Mhm.
Um, I did a quick back of the fag packet calculation on one lady's model once, and it came out at 1%. And I knew, therefore, there was a mistake
Yeah,
somewhere in the
somewhere.
NI calculation. And she'd just tweaked something for something else and hadn't realised there was a knock-on impact on how NI would be calculated. But that change it was I think the contract was worth 400,000, and the error in the model due to this calculation was something like 10 times the amount of the value of the contract. So it can be really, really important to make sure we've sense checked the outputs. Do they look
Yeah.
reasonable? If we've undercooked the costs of NI by 7%, that could eat up the whole profit on a contract. So doing your sense checks of, staff costs are a relatively easy one to sense check. We know what NI rates are. We might have an idea of what pension contributions are.
Yeah. Yeah.
We know what tax rates are. But even if you're just looking at, I don't know, other costs, if your stationary costs come out at 90% of revenue, it probably means you're either buying too much stationery or you've got something wrong in your calculation.
Yes, exactly.
Um,
Yeah.
but that's the kind of question we laugh at it. But that's the sort of thing you need to be looking at to say, does that appear reasonable? And actually, it might be that we've input stationery costs at a 90% of revenue, but our business is going to fail if that's the case. And
If that's the case, yeah.
we need to go back and say, well, how can we reduce the stationery we're going to use? It's a silly example, but it's an easy one to try and explain the concept of, look at each section of costs. Does it appear sensible as a percentage? What do we think is reasonable? And again, we touched on scenario analysis. The number of times I've had people say to me, can we use Monte Carlo simulation? I've never used it in my life. I've got a maths degree with a large amount of stats in it. And even with that, my stats ability to use Monte Carlo is not good enough. But Monte Carlo works where you've got, it's an engineering process. If you need, if you're cutting sheets of metal at 3 millimeters, you know that there might be 1% that doesn't come out within that 3 millimeters. So you can use Monte Carlo to say what percentage might not fall within the tolerance levels. When you're sticking a finger in the air to try and work out what you think costs are going to be on a contract over the next 10 years, Monte Carlo isn't going to add anything particularly relevant. But I'm a far greater fan of using generally 3-point estimation, which is best case, most likely, worst case. And you might do 5 cases, but it's about saying, where do we think it's likely to sit? Now, what happens if it's 10% higher on this cost or 10% lower on, well, it could be on cost, but revenue 10% lower. So running scenarios to say, if this is 10% out, either up or down, and this line's 5% the other way, what would that do to our account? So you're really looking at what are your sensitive numbers.
Yes.
And your sensitive numbers are the ones you want to be all over.
Yes. And that kind of comes back to, your input section and being able to change the numbers or set it up in a way where you can, as you have, your best case, worst case, most likely case, you can choose which one to run through your model type thing.
And if you've set that input up, it's much easier than overwriting an input and saying, oh, what was the case we actually want to be using. So, I've had it where I just set up a scenario tab within my inputs, and you've got 5 columns. Using choose function to say, am I running scenario 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5? And that allows you to very quickly say, what if this happens? And often that what if can influence, and in the process of building a model, if you change an input and suddenly you get an answer you're not expecting, there's 2 things I then look at. One is the input correct? But 2 is there something in the calculation which actually we haven't thought about, which means we now need to go back and revisit that calculation, because by having a different input value and how inputs and different calculations interact, it's knocked something out in the calculation. So this is where a model is probably never finished. And that's one thing I'd say, never in the file title of a model put the word final. You are asking to do more work. And final or final version 2 is meaningless. So version control is something that is very important.
That's true.
And it might be you save 3 different scenarios of a model down, but save that as scenario number, whatever. But no, never put the word final in a file title.
Yes, I agree about version control, and also having in your input tab or even a separate tab, who did it, what date you did it, what version it is, because somebody somewhere in the organization will be potentially using the previous model, the previous version, and then you're up the spout.
And initials are not helpful. I always use date and version number, or to be honest, just version number. And every time I send the model out, I change the version number so that we know there are not 2 versions floating around with different inputs.
Exactly.
And I also use a tracker sheet within a model. So once the model is in use, I will put a tracker on, and then it's slightly manual, but you just pull in your key output numbers. And then when you make a change, you go and copy and paste those output numbers so you can see what the variance
All right.
You capture the variance that that
Mhm.
input has made. And so if somebody says to you, oh, well, we made 5 different changes to staff costs, what is it? But you've made other changes in between. What was the impact of all of those staff cost changes? You can then go back and add up those 5 variances relating to
Yeah.
staff costs.
Okay.
So
Okay.
that can be very powerful
Okay.
when changing forecasts or bid models.
Yeah. I just want to finish on one question, which as accountants we deal with quite a lot in terms of how do we identify the risks, the opportunities in our kind of model, in our spreadsheet? What can we do to spot the trends that potentially could turn,
Yeah,
bad in the future?
sure.
How can we be a bit more aware of that?
I think one of the first things for me is having graphical outputs is very, very
All
important.
right. Yeah.
It's much easier to see a blip on a graph than it is to run your eye across a set of
True enough.
numbers.
Yeah, true enough.
So making sure you've got graphs, but then it comes back to what makes a good modeler. It's business understanding and
Hmm.
working with your business peers to say, what are the things that we could see potentially going wrong within the business? I mean, I tend to focus on risks. Opportunities are great, but risks are what really scupper us. So it is, again, coming back to the scenario analysis. What do we think are the things that might happen? And do we understand what that means? I once worked on a project relating to housing, and the revenue went down that we received as volume of people to be housed went up.
Hmm.
You take a step back and you think, great, volume, a sort of revenue reduction or discount for additional, for bigger volume makes sense in many circumstances. But when it comes to housing people, it doesn't, because it gets more expensive to find housing the more you need of it. So
Yes.
actually, you'd really want your revenue to go up the
Yeah.
more people you're housing. Whereas somebody had gone, oh, right, more volume, great, we'll give a discount on volume. And that led to all kinds of problems because
Right.
we were then, our costs were going up, but our revenue was going down in that circumstance. So have you understood your scenario, I suppose, is the
Yeah.
question.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And really being thoughtful about what is the impact of this number changing?
Yes.
If this input is higher than we expect, is that a good thing or a bad thing? And what are the knock-on implications? So it might be a change in volume, but what is the impact on both revenue and costs? In this instance, they'd only thought about, well, let's think about what we do revenue wise. They hadn't looked at what the impact of that was on cost.
Yes.
And I think a very different decision would have been made if they'd realised how much the costs were going to ratchet up
Yes. Yes. That's a
at
very
that
good
point.
kind of thing to finish on, isn't it? To be a good modeler, ask the question, what is the impact of this number
Yes,
changing? Understand the impact, and that
absolutely.
helps you become a great modeler.
Yeah. So to be a great modeler, you need really good Excel skills, but you need analytical and
Absolutely.
insight skills just as much.
Perfect. What a great way to finish. Thank you very much for your time, Catrin. It's been a great pleasure speaking to you. I thoroughly enjoyed that. Thank you for
You're very
joining.
welcome. Very welcome. Very much enjoyed it too.
Cheerio.
Bye.